They called him the Madman of the Ridge because in the late 1800s, when every other homesteader was busy reinforcing roofs or digging storm cellars, this man was outside doing something that looked utterly ridiculous to anyone who passed by. It was late autumn, that uneasy time of year when the air begins to smell like iron, when the leaves turn brittle brown, warning of the deadly cold that's creeping closer every night. While his neighbors stacked their firewood against the walls of their cabins, just as their fathers and grandfathers had done for generations, this man was building something strange. A long, narrow tunnel made of scrap canvas and rough timber poles. It wasn't a tent meant for sleeping, and it certainly wasn't a barn. It was far too low and too narrow for either. The structure stretched from his woodshed all the way to his front door, snaking across the yard like a giant fabric serpent. People in the nearby settlement laughed at him. Resources were scarce in those days, and wasting good canvas and sturdy poles on the covered walkway seemed like the height of stupidity. Those materials could have patched a drafty window or sealed a leaky roof. Riders passed by on horseback, shivering in their coats, pointing at the flapping structure. They joked that he was building a hallway for ghosts, or that the isolation of the mountain had finally driven him mad. But the man never said a word to defend himself. He just kept working, tying knots, driving stakes in the freezing mud, pulling the canvas tight enough to shed water, but loose enough to breathe. Because he knew something the others didn't, something he may have learned from indigenous tribes or discovered through years of bitter failure. The greatest killer in winter wasn't the cold, it was moisture. On the frontier, firewood was life itself. It was heat, it was cooking, it was the only way to melt snow into drinking water. If your wood got wet and froze, you weren't just uncomfortable, you were finished. The neighbors believed stacking wood under the eaves was enough. They trusted the heat from their cabin walls to keep the logs dry, but they didn't understand the invisible enemy that was coming. The man did. He knew that when deep snow arrived, the wind wouldn't simply blow over the cabin. It would swirl, it would eddy, it would drive fine powder snow into every crack of a woodpile. That snow would melt during the day, then refreeze at night into hard glaze of ice, turning firewood into useless frozen bricks. That useless tunnel wasn't just a covered walkway, it was survival engineering. A deliberate transition zone, a buffer of air designed to keep moisture out and dryness in when temperatures plunged to 30 below zero. As heavy gray clouds rolled over the mountain peaks, blotting out the sun and draining the world into shades of white and steel, the laughter in the valley stopped. The air grew still, heavy, the kind of silence that feels like a predator drawing close. The man finished the final tie-down, glanced at the darkening sky, and stepped inside his cabin. And the question lingered in the frozen air. Was he a fool wasting time on a fabric toy, or the only man truly ready for what was coming? Before we see who survives the night, hit the like button if you think old-school survival knowledge beats modern gadgets. Now, let's see what happens when the blizzard hits. The storm didn't arrive. It assaulted the mountain like a freight train made of ice. In less than 48 hours, over 5 feet of snow buried the valley. For the neighbors who had mocked the tunnel, reality set in fast. They opened their doors to walls of white. After hours of shoveling, they reached their woodpiles, only to discover disaster. Heat leaking from their poorly insulated cabins had melted snow during the day. At night, brutal cold froze that runoff solid, fusing their logs into massive blocks of ice. Men hacked at their own fuel with axes in blinding wind, risking frostbite just to free a single log. And when they managed to pry one loose, it was soaked through. It hissed and steamed in the fire, but refused to burn hot. Inside those cabins, temperatures dropped. The stoves burned energy boiling water instead of heating rooms. Families fed more and more wood into dying fires, consuming supplies at twice the normal rate just to stay alive. Children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, huddled together. Fathers cursed the weather, never realizing the outcome had been decided weeks earlier when they trusted tradition instead of adapting to the wind. Up on the ridge, the scene was different, almost peaceful. The man opened his door and stepped not into the gale, but into the dim, canvas-filtered light of his tunnel. The fabric thundered in the wind, but the ground beneath his feet was dry and clear. He walked in his shirt sleeves, no heavy coat, down to his woodshed. The air inside was cold, but bone dry. The tunnel worked as a thermal buffer, preventing the violent temperature swings that caused condensation and ice. The wind slid harmlessly over the rounded canvas. Snow had nowhere to collect. And because he didn't battle the storm for fuel, he only burned what he needed, while others exhausted their supplies just trying to dry wet logs. He carried armfuls of dry hickory back to his stove. The wood caught instantly, radiating deep, penetrating heat, the kind that warms bone and dries air. The tunnel wasn't just a hallway, it was a time machine, lifting him out of survival mode and allowing him to simply live. It proved that the most important survival tool isn't an axe or a rifle, but foresight. But as the storm dragged on for weeks, a new danger emerged. Surviving the first night is one thing, but what happens when food runs out? Subscribe so you don't miss the final lesson. When spring finally came, turning the valley into mud and meltwater, the true cost of winter was revealed. Neighbors emerged gaunt and hollow-eyed. Months of wet wood smoke and cold nights had taken their toll. Their wood piles were ruined. Many had burned furniture. Some had torn up floorboards just to survive February. They climbed the ridge, expecting to find a frozen corpse. Instead, they found the man shaving calmly on his porch, healthy, strong. His tunnel had been dismantled, canvas folded neatly away, but its success was everywhere. His yard was firm and dry, his remaining woodpile pristine, curing perfectly in spring air. Ashamed, they asked how he had done it. He pointed to the folded canvas. He explained that the tunnel didn't just block snow, it created a microclimate, using the Earth's own warmth to stay just a few degrees warmer than the outside. He survived not because he was tougher, but because he understood that fighting nature is a losing battle, while working with it requires humility and imagination. The neighbors who once laughed now measured distances between their own doors and sheds, planning tunnels for the next winter. The story spread not as magic, but as practical wisdom, what we now call passive design, shaping the environment without burning energy. Today, we rely on central heating and Gore-Tex. We forget that for most of human history, staying dry was everything, and a strip of canvas could mean the difference between spring flowers and a frozen grave. The man on the ridge proved the greatest survival tool isn't something you buy. It's the willingness to look foolish while quietly building the thing that saves your life. So, would you have built the tunnel or laughed with the neighbors? Tell me in the comments. And if you want another real story of survival genius, hit the video on screen now about a man who survived a blizzard using nothing but a candle. Thanks for watching.